Thank you for joining us tonight at this Declassified Live. We're here this evening to discuss the cost of war. The primary cost of war, of course, is always paid by those people who are in war zones around the world. Thousands of Iranians and Lebanese people have been killed and thousands injured, infrastructure destroyed, the environmental impact of that, generational impact, the trauma and displacement. The price of war is huge. Tonight, we're going to be thinking about the domestic impact of another illegal war. What does a war over 4,000 miles away mean for people here in the UK? As millions of people in the UK are already struggling with the stress and strain and the weight of their bills, more price rises are the last thing anybody needs. The ceasefire is not over. It tentatively holds, but there are huge economic consequences for the illegal war so far. One of those being the tension around the Strait of Hormuz. We're on day 67 of the illegal US-Israel war on Iran. Operation Fury from the USA, Operation Lion's Roar from Israel, and now announced today, Project Freedom, with, and I quote from the press conference today and from General Dan Kane, is with the objective of facilitating the safe passage of international commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. But will this mean further escalation of tension, especially with the unpredictability of the illegal war so far? What will this mean for the Strait of Hormuz and rising prices here in the UK? We'll also look at how the UK is a participant in this illegal war too, as much as the British legacy media don't like to characterize it that way. There's so much to discuss, and as ever, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to pop it in the comments and I'll put them to our fabulous guests this evening. Tonight we'll have Declassified editor Phil Miller, chief reporter John McEvoy, and economist Dr. Carolina Alves. You know, I'm going to say this, but I need to. It takes a great deal of time and research in the team to cover our investigations. Declassified UK investigates stories others won't touch. But we can only do it if we're backed by a community of viewers and readers like you. So if you value independent, fearless journalism like ours, please join us today. It takes very little time to become a monthly supporter and helps keep the fearless journalism alive. So if you can do that, go to declassifieduk.org/join to set up a monthly donation. I'm really, really pleased that our editor, Phil Miller, has joined us tonight. Welcome to you, Phil. You are very often beavering away in the background, or the antithesis to that, chasing people down the street, asking them questions. I wonder if you could start us off tonight, though, Phil, if you could give us a bit of a recap in what way the UK are involved in this illegal war in Iran, because it seems to have taken hold, this idea, you know, it was an attack line in Prime Minister's questions before the recess, that we're not involved, you know, this kind of a distancing from this illegal war. But how are we involved, Phil?
Hi, Laura. Yes, the UK has been heavily involved in supporting Trump's illegal war on Iran. As far back as January, we did a reporting trip up to Lakenheath in Suffolk, so not far from Cambridge. There's a huge American Air Force base there. And already we were seeing a buildup of fighter jets going both. So already we were seeing a buildup of fighter jets at Lakenheath. They have their own detachment of F-15 fighter jets there all the time that were being sent out to the Gulf in anticipation of this attack. And we were also seeing Air Force units that are normally based in America transiting over the Atlantic, landing at Lakenheath, and then going on to the Gulf. So it was being used as a staging post in that way as well. And just down the road from Lakenheath, although we didn't actually go there ourselves, is another US Air Force base called Mildenhall. And that's where a lot of the refueling aircraft are based. So they were similarly going out to the Gulf. And some of the early warning and aerial surveillance aircraft are based there as well. So that was a big buildup that we were seeing as early as January. And then by the time that the attack started, there was that very brief first day or so when Starmer refused permission for Trump to use UK bases at Diego Garcia and Fairford for bombing Iran, but then very quickly did a U-turn and came up with this legal framework of saying, well, they'd only allow these defensive strikes, which they've never really fully explained how that would work. And so that's when the base at Fairford, which is on the other side of London, near to Swindon in Gloucestershire, that base there was having a build-up of these B-1 and B-52 aircraft, which are the heavy bombers. I mean, the British Air Force don't really have an equivalent, but these heavy bomber aircraft, so the B-52 is actually a very old aircraft. If you look at Vietnam War footage of them carpet bombing Southeast Asia, it was those aircraft that they were using. So slightly,
when they see US soldiers on UK soil kind of nonchalantly just ferrying 2,000-pound bombs around the place to go and drop them in the context of an illegal war, I think a lot of the British public were quite shocked.
Yeah, so those were the bombs that we were seeing being loaded. And yeah, shall I go on, Laura? Or...
Yeah, go on. Sorry, you weren't supposed to be rudely interrupted by John there, Phil. So apologies about that. You carry on.
What's to come. And then we did another trip up to Fairford, but the second time we also went to RAF Welford, which is another site about half an hour away from there. And that's where the bombs are stored in preparation for these kind of wars. And it's this huge area of land next to like a golf course and a clay pigeon shooting site. And the landscape is just marked with all these bunkers. And that's where the bombs were being stored. And activists had said they were seeing lorry convoys go from there sort of 2 or 3 times a day, taking the bombs to Fairford. And by the time we filmed there, it looked like most of the bombs had already been cleared out. And they were flying in these cruise missile stockpiles instead from other US bases in Europe. And I think the missiles, the bombs that you saw in that footage are maybe about $100,000 a bomb. And the cruise missiles they were flying in were about $1 million a bomb. And they were they were depleting these stockpiles apparently. There was a Bloomberg report saying they were using up a vast amount of these weapons. So that shows the kind of intensity at which they were bombing Iran and the importance of Fairford as a base to do that, because it's one of the only bases in Europe that they have with not just a very long runway, but all the maintenance and support facilities that they need on site to keep these aircraft going. Every time we were there, we were seeing the ground crew constantly doing maintenance on the aircraft. So yeah, that whole setup is there for them in Fairford. It was obviously really important that Starmer was letting Trump use that base.
And there's been a ceasefire, albeit there still has been fire. They talked today about the ceasefire still being in place, but have we noticed any activity? Do we have any intelligence at the moment about any movement on the UK bases during the ceasefire, or is that not being possible?
I think what's been observed is some of the aircraft that were damaged out in the Gulf, particularly some of the refueling aircraft that were damaged when Iran bombed the US bases in Saudi Arabia, and there's sort of shrapnel marks on some of the aircraft. They'd been patched up temporarily in the Gulf, and then they were flying back to places like Mildenhall for more serious repairs, which again kind of indicates the importance of these sites as kind of forward operating bases for the US military, for them to be able to get a lot closer to Iran than if they were having to launch these attacks from the US mainland.
Yeah, well, I was just going to go into that, if you don't mind, Phil, because I know that as well, we saw with the genocide, quite often people would say about the surveillance flights, what is the point of the UK doing that? Why can't Israel carry out the surveillance flights themselves? And the same too with this illegal war on Iran. Why are the UK bases, why are we strategically important to the USA?
Yeah, I think it's kind of geography, and it's just a very long-term investment that the US Air Force has made in having bases like this at Fairford, in anticipation that if there would be a war in the Middle East, then Britain would let them go along with it. These bases have been used for many other wars over the years in Yugoslavia and Libya and places like that, Iraq. So yeah, all the infrastructure was there. They even at Fairford, I think they have a special facility for the B-2 stealth bombers, which we didn't see come there this time, but for like redoing the stealth coating. So they have a special paint facility there that they built at great expense just for that scenario. So a lot of investment has gone into it, and I think that's partly why they were so shocked that there was even the slightest pushback from the Starmer governments. Of course, they relented pretty quickly, but then you saw Trump kind of carrying this kind of grudge against Starmer with his statements about the UK not doing anything to support him. That carried on despite all this footage of the US bombs and so on being loaded at this base in Gloucestershire.
I mean, it is quite remarkable, isn't it, that has carried in such a dominant way in people's minds that we have stayed out of this. And I just wonder, you are an editor of an independent media organization. I know the work that goes into investigations here. What do you think of the media kind of not pushing back on this idea that we are involved? Everything that you've just outlined there, the footage that we just saw of bombs being loaded, US troops here, US bases here, how is that being constructed? What are the legacy media up to?
I think the problem was they just took the line they were being fed from the government about these being defensive strikes and didn't really probe what that meant or how it was going to be enforced. So the government was saying the US could only use these bases if they were going to attack missile sites that were being fired at British interests in the region. But there were no kind of follow-up questions about, well, how would they know that those missiles were only going to be fired at British interests? How do you define British interests? And not at the US and Israel, who were unlawfully attacking Iran. Did the UK have to sign off on the target list before these planes took off? Was the target list evolving mid-flight based on real-time intelligence? If so, how could the UK really police that and sign off on it? Were they then auditing the strike, looking at the battle damage assessments post-strike to see whether the targets that the US said they were hitting were actually the ones that they hit? So none of these questions were being asked by the mainstream media, who would have access to ministers. The MOD refused to put a minister up to answer our questions. And when MPs did ask these questions in Parliament, the questions weren't answered.
It just seems so predictable, doesn't it? This pattern and trying to get justice, just like in terms of the genocide in Gaza and the work that you and Alex have done around the spy flights. There is so much work to be done on what has already been done, whilst also trying to keep track of how the government is complicit in ongoing illegal wars. I know that you don't have all night to stay with us tonight, but I did just wonder, you are across a lot of stories in the organisation, Phil. And I did just wonder if there was any kind of editor's pick for this month, anything that you wanted our audience to, with everything going on, might not have seen an investigation that we've done, something that you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, a story that we kept digging away at while all this was going on was the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was this aid group in Gaza, the only one that the Israelis really allowed to operate in many parts of Gaza. And there was footage from during the war there of people being shot when they were going to get aid. And my colleague Alex Morris managed to track down a British security contractor who was out there working as part of this organization, and had filmed some of these massacres himself on his phone, these stampedes of desperate, starving Palestinians trying to get food, and was willing to speak out about what had happened, from inside the base, and his efforts to raise concerns about murders that were taking place under their watch. So yeah, if you haven't seen that film already, I think it's really powerful and it's a must watch.
Yeah, I very much agree. And when you're watching it, you can't help but think this was one moment in time in a series of horrific things over the course of, over 2 years. It just seems absolutely unbelievable what the people there have had to endure. So I also endorse that message, that you should watch that film. Okay, we do have a question from the audience, Phil, so hopefully you can just take that before you need to go. When will the Defensive Argument and Secrets Act be abolished in regards to being an argument for war crimes? And I don't know if you want to say a little bit about some of that, about the secrecy that surrounds war participation, military tactics, and, agreements with other countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen this under the Labour government and before that, the Conservative government. In some ways, actually, the Conservative government were a little bit more transparent on some things. I mean, during the Saudi war in Yemen, I feel like Conservative ministers were actually answering parliamentary questions a bit more than they did once the Gaza genocide started and once Labour came in. So I think, I don't really think there'll be much change if Labour or Conservative stay in power. I think if you saw a new party to the left of Labour, then possibly. But even then, there will always be huge pushback from Whitehall, who's entrenched in this culture of, the civil service are entrenched in this culture of secrecy. They don't really seem to think that they're working for the public. And so this transparency around issues of war crimes is not foremost in their minds. And actually, you're seeing at the moment from the right this huge campaign to repeal any attempts to hold soldiers accountable for war crimes that they've committed overseas or in Northern Ireland.
Absolutely unbelievable. Phil, I know everybody really appreciates the work that you do. So thank you for taking time to join us this evening. Really, really appreciate your time. I know you have so many things that you're covering and your head is into at the moment. So really appreciate it and have an enjoyable rest of your evening.
Thank you. And you.
Thank you. Just so you know, this Saturday, Phil is actually going to be in Newcastle along with our colleague, Alex Morris, and we're going to be doing a film screening of their groundbreaking documentary, Britain's Gaza Spy Flights Scandal. That's going to be at the wonderful independent cinema, The Star and Shadow. You can get tickets now and that's going to be starting at 2 p.m. There are a whole series of questions that documentary raises that we still don't have answers to from the government about Britain's participation in the genocide in Gaza, and lots of questions surrounding the spy flights. So please do take a look at that film if you haven't seen it already. And also, if you're in and around the Newcastle area on Saturday, grab yourself a ticket. I'm just going to show you now, before I bring on our guest, Dr. Carolina Alves, some which did a study. They do a regular survey into how people are feeling about the economy, about the household finances. And I'm just going to take you through some of their most recent findings now, because I think it's important to say that we are suffering in the UK. We've had a long period of austerity. If we just pop those up on the screen while I'm speaking, that would be great. We've had a long period of austerity. We then have had a Labour government who seem to be doing negligible amount, in relation to tackling poverty. Here, 15% of households reported going without some foods, and 1 in 10 are skipping meals. I mean, that's quite incredible. I think that equates to something like 3 million households. If we move on, the vast majority of consumers are worried about fuel prices. I just don't think that will be a shock to anyone. And food prices. I don't know if any of you feel like this, but every time I go into the supermarket, you can hear people saying, you cannot believe how much one bag of shopping is costing. Yeah, I think this isn't a surprise either, that people are in financial difficulty and people are already cutting back on essentials, dipping into savings, selling possessions or borrowing. I think there's one more. Yeah, consumer confidence is in a not very good state. It fell by 8 points to -23, the lowest levels in 3 years. And then again, confidence in the future of the UK economy, I think this makes complete sense to me as well, I'm sure it will to you, is the lowest since the height of the cost of living crisis. Thank you for putting those up. I think it's very, very difficult to think about this war that we are far away from, politically, because we haven't had a choice in our participation in the UK, but also geographically, how far away Gaza feels, how far away Iran feels, but then the economic shockwaves that directly impact people in the UK. And I'm really, really pleased to say that Dr. Carolina Alves is joining us tonight to try and help us make some sense of this, because you are an economist, and I know you'll be thinking so much about the shockwaves of war, the economic impact that has on people in the UK and around the world. So first of all, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And is it the start of term? Is it the end of term? Where are you at?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. It's the second week of the term. So yeah, the craziness was last week, but yeah,
Okay. Yeah, you're in the flow. You're in the flow of things now. I mean, I think this is probably a really difficult question, Carolina. But could you start us off with the big picture, and how much do we think that the war on Iran is costing the UK? I'm sure you can't put a figure on it. I saw in America this week, Congress was finding it very, very difficult to put a figure on their participation, and there's much controversy around that. But could you just start to disentangle some of the ways in which war costs?
Yes, sure, and thank you for having me here. No, indeed, is difficult to calculate that costs, if anything, because there are also the indirect costs. But the most obvious one is definitely the rising cost of living and household insecurity, which is what we actually are seeing on TV all the time. And what we have here is basically, and we can try to unpack this later on, so I can give you a big picture now. The main point here is definitely the energy price volatility, which will impact fuel, transport, and food costs in the UK. And you can come back to this in terms of explaining how. So of course, this has a direct impact to especially the low income households in the UK, and increased poverty and debt and reliance on the local welfare systems, right? So which also is a extra cost for the government. In terms of the debt, the indirect way that this impact is because if the prices increases, then of course the main reaction of the central bank is to increase interest rates, which I can also come back to this. The other aspect, which again difficult to calculate but is there, is the pressure we have on immigrants and diasporic communities. Of course, the Iranian and the broader Middle Eastern communities in the UK, they're going to have the emotional cost, the financial cost, the social burdens, but also there is the issue of remittances that are stopped from here to this country. So we can also go back to this. And one more cost that is again difficult to calculate but is there, is the strain that this war would have on public services in local institutions, right? So if you think in terms, if you go back, think in terms like in last year in February, well, the UK had this commitment to increase defense spending in 2.5% of the GDP by 2027. So of course, this will have an impact on other spendings in the UK. And at the same time, I heard you talking about austerity before. At the same time, we know that local councils across the UK are already having a problem of funding gap. So basically, I would say that the short answer is we have just a partial way to calculate these costs, right? And you can do that through military operations, but the main one would be energy shocks and inflation. We could also look at the GDP losses, because of course in this moment of uncertainty, as economists they like to say, investors are not investing much, at least not in the type of investment that will then generate income for the economy. So we have basically, if I could summarize, it would be, let's say, the direct military costs and security costs. Then we have, of course, the inflation shock, the prices, and then lastly, the question of GDP losses. But all this is very difficult to calculate. I was trying to get a number before, and to kind of discuss, and I think through, especially the inflation costs, and considering that the government is not stepping in with subsidies or anything, it can actually reach 10 billion. So it's insane, actually. Of course, it's all estimated. You need to look properly into these calculations, but yeah. And I think the last point I would say as well regarding this, because there are many people asking about these costs, and for the UK is a bit difficult as well to calculate that, because different than the Iraq or the Afghanistan war, where there was like a budget, a budget for the war. We don't have right now a UK-Iran war budget, right? Or clear declared war expenditures. So this also makes difficult to kind of calculate. Sorry,
Yeah.
was what's going on here?
No, I mean, no, that was brilliant. I mean, it's a. I mean, you've given us so many kind of different ways in which cost occurs, and if we're talking about just for the UK, and I completely get that you would have to sit down probably for weeks trying to calculate the true cost. But if we're looking at about 10 billion,
Yeah, 10. I think 10. Sorry, I'm kind of should have write down tens of billion of pounds. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, it certainly wouldn't shock me if it's that amount, especially when we start to think about some of the prices. And I know this might be connected to the USA that Phil talked about in terms of like the individual prices of bombs and things like that.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and that kind of spend at a time when, as we spoke about before, that approximately 3 million houses might be cutting back on a meal, for example, just to kind of get through, and probably so that children can eat and things like that. I wonder if you could just really, actually, let's play this clip from Tom Fletcher, and then we'll talk about the impact of the blockage on the Strait of Hormuz.
Sure.
On the Straits of Hormuz, I'm really worried about food costs, energy costs, as you say, fertilizer costs. I'm worried that actually further escalation will damage other supply routes. All of this has a direct impact on our humanitarian supplies, including going to areas of key need in sub-Saharan Africa. But more broadly, it drives up the prices, and so it drives more people into greater need.
I mean, I don't want to be part of this kind of alarmist culture, Carolina, that's like, there's a big crisis coming and people are going to start stockpiling again and things like that. I don't want us to be part of that. However, I do think that we need to kind of assess the realities of the shock of war, and specifically that area of the world being blocked and being kind of caught in the middle of this kind of, is very strategically important, and kind of being caught in the middle of war, if you like, and being used by the USA. So could you try and set out for us, and again, I know this is probably really hard, but why do fuel, food and energy prices rise when an area like the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, for example?
Perfect. Let's try to do this. And I agree with you, right? We shouldn't get into this kind of mindset that basically the world's going to end tomorrow. But you're right, there is something that you should be very careful, and perhaps then the way to answer this question is to split and have a very critical perspective, which is that the issue of uncertainty. So everyone is like, oh, what's happening? And very often I especially, and of course we know the world is uncertain, right? But I see in that context that uncertainty is kind of playing an ideological role, to go back to your point, because what happened is markets, they like the stability, so they can speculate, right? They can we're going to get into this. And it has always been political, although in economics we like to say, oh, financial markets, they're not political. What's happening now, and that's why we're using this word uncertainty to justify these increasing prices and so on, and get everyone to panic, is that the markets are concerned in terms of these markets, because of the geopolitics, being more political than before. So there is that we have to be very careful. And here in this first block, I want to highlight that what's happening is energy. Let's say energy as a totality here, not to get into gas or whatever. Is very interesting because is a commodity that is treated as, let's say, a speculative asset class. What that means is that it allows for the geopolitical risk to factor in the price. And let's see if I can explain that. So it's basically you can monetize on the asset, right? In terms of trading now, trading in the future, and so on. And that is not an accident. That is within that context of liberalization of financial markets and so on, that we allowed such a key commodity for social reproduction to be in that situation, right? So what we have is a highly financialized, geopolitically charged resource when it comes to energy, right? So basically what that means is oil markets, they're not governed by, like barrels or pipelines or costs and so on, but they are governed through expectations, expectations, future markets, and of course the geopolitics signaling. So that's where we are. So basically the energy price formation is more, because of this, of being highly financialized, is basically more sensitive to political announcements, military conflict, and and financial speculation in general. So that's where we are with energy prices, right? What determines that price is extremely, let's say, out of our control in terms of being on these financial markets. Now, what that means in a context of the Iran war, and you can interrupt me, otherwise I can just keep speaking for ages. So
I'm just honestly really attentively listening. So yeah, I'm trying to, even just your first point, that uncertainty in the market is playing an ideological role. That's a huge point. I'm still trying to digest that. Yeah, please do go on. This is fascinating.
We can go back to this, because to be very honest, I started thinking about this last week and I'm still kind of getting my head around, but we can come back to this. So, okay, so what that means, like this higher financialized, market we have for energy. So when we have, in the context of the Iran war, you have the Strait of Hormuz that everyone's talking about, which is this critical, let's say, global checkpoint. What happened is we're talking, and I'm sure we have discussed that, about 1/5 of the world's trade oil in large share of the the liquefied natural gas kind of normally passing through that Strait of Hormuz. So when that's blocked, threatened, or militarized, right, the markets, and I hate to do this, the market, but because given the context of this financial market, what we have there is that this market react, expecting less energy to reach global suppliers, right? Even if nothing has happened yet physically. Last week, probably you followed that, there was just this speculation of Trump having a military briefing, and then the price just spiked and so on. So basically, what is the context here is prices, or this energy price, into expectations of scarcity supply, because it may be that this is not happening there, right? So this is let's say the first kind of aspect you should keep in mind. So the second aspect is, in that context, energy prices will be the first to be affected and fast. And you can come back to this why fast. Why? Because traders, they are expecting this disruption, right? That is what they're expecting. And what we have is the trade of energy happens almost at immediate level. So we are having here oil and gas prices jumping, right? Because of this concern of scarcity, what's happening next, the uncertainty, I tell you, which, let's go back to that later. So the reaction to this kind of expectation of changes is shipping insurance premiums are increasing, right? Suppliers demand much higher prices to cover their risks because they don't know what's happening. And so this is the second point. So because oil and gas, they are global traded commodity, right? What happened is let's just focus on the UK. The UK price will rise, even if the UK is not actually physically cut off from supplies, because the UK in that context, as many other countries or imported commodity countries, they are price takers in that global energy market, right? So the minute that goes up, there's nothing the UK or most of the countries they can do, right? That's the price they have to take. So this is the first thing that happens. In the case of the UK, this direct impact the UK energy price cap that is set by the Ofgem, which is this kind of limit of how much household can spend in a year and so on. And that is a calculation. And it's a calculation, so this is not speculative, right? So what happened is, when the Ofgem is calculating that, there are different factors you can come to that. But the main one is the UK wholesale gas prices, right? Which has just been increased in a global market. So this calculation, then it kind of changed almost automatically, and is not speculative. And right now, given the changes just now in the first week of May in the wholesale gas prices, the calculation now is that this UK energy price cap can increase to around 20%. So we can come back to this. So this is what's happening. So we have this highly speculative asset. So anything that happens there, investor can just play around, right? So it's not democratic. It's a key commodity for households, but it doesn't really matter. It's a context of financial liberalization. That's what happens, right? Then these prices are determined in this global market. In countries such as the UK, they are price takers, they get this. And the main problem here is that will impact the UK wholesale gas prices, right? So this is the first point. And this higher energy price, of course, will feed firstly in petrol, diesel, jet fuel and so on, is the first thing that impacts. So of course, everything that depends on this, driving, public transport, any kind of logistic, will therefore.
The impact is just absolutely huge, isn't it? I mean, okay, so we've got that part, but food is more complex, isn't it? Why might food prices rise because of war?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question, and it has to do with how we organize our, let's say, food systems, right? So basically, this is down to transport costs and also fertilizers. You can go there. So what happened is, basically, based on what we have just discussed, as we talked about, the transport cost would be higher, right? And that is what would push food prices, because the modern kind of food system, they are energy intensive, right? So farming, that you rely in fuel for machineries, fertilizers are made from natural gas, so impact directly. Food is transported long distance by road, ship, and refrigeration. This is all energy. And on the top of that, we have the electricity costs, especially in the UK, that's coupled with the gas price, also being part of this, right? So food producers, they will face higher input costs because of electricity costs, right? So retailers are paying more for transport, for storage, for everything. And then through the supply chain, that price, the higher this increase in prices is basically passing along to the supply chain. So even if domestically which happens as well in the UK. But I think you have food sovereignty in the UK. Still, you'd become more expensive because energy is embedded at every single stage of these modern food systems. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm just thinking, okay, right, we need to get you to explain mortgages then. So is this again about the cost of borrowing, about inflation? Like, why might mortgage rates go up because of war?
That is a very interesting question, and it has to do with the way we deal with interest rates and inflation in our current let's say the macro institutions we have. So basically what's happening there is we have I'm trying not to be I love talking about that, so you have to kind of control me. So basically we have what we call the inflation target regime, which probably we have heard before, which is let's say a framework to control inflation. That's the prices going up. That happens through interest rates, right? Kind of this is basically what economists that are more critical to this would say. If you want to deal with inflation, you have just monetary policy is the only game in town, which basically increasing interest rates, right? Why? Because the framework is based that inflation is a demand, is explained through the side of demand. So if you have more consumption, if workers are getting paid, lots of money, you have the situation where the economy is overheated, as they say. So you need to put interest rates up to kind of slow down that process, right? So this is actually our framework for controlling inflation, inflation. So what happens right now is the central banks, they are in a very difficult situation, particularly the central bank in the UK, because they are resisting increasing the interest rates. Because of course, if you increase interest rates, you create recession. People already in debt, they will be in trouble. More if you don't have a fixed rate in your mortgage, that's going to generate a problem for you as well, and so on. So the UK, the Bank of England is okay. What we're doing here, however, the framework, the mindset is you need to increase it to control inflation. But in that case, inflation is not coming from that demand side. Inflation is coming from this geopolitical the geopolitical risks we were talking before. So the reality is, if the Bank of England does not increase the interest rates, we have a problem in terms of credibility of their framework, right? But if they increase, there are two problems. We're going to have a recession because we can go in terms of the mortgage and debts and so on, but also investments, etc., in a context where households in the UK are already struggling, right? And at the same time, chances are they really going to kind of control the prices, because the reality is the price increase is coming from geopolitical risks, what we call a supply side kind of shock, right? So what my concern is the last data from last week is saying that inflation can reach 6.2 or 6.2%, something like this, and can go for 3 years or more. That kind of scenario, we're not talking about shock anymore. We're talking about a crisis for every single household, especially low income in the UK, because the entire price system is going to be at that high, right? When we are already facing wages being stagnated, and context of austerity and so on. So that's where we are now. So basically what's happening here, prices go up. The first reaction of the central bank in most of the globe now, sadly, this inflation target regime was literally one size fits all. It's the credibility for central banks. They have to rely on that. So they have to increase the interest rates. But the mindset, explain the rationale is, if it was a demand side inflation, because that's what economists are relying on. And in that case, that's not what's happening. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does make sense, although I have this overwhelming feeling of just kind of the walls closing in, the kind of all of the different economic threats, inability. I mean, actually, could we just play the clip from Starmer in Parliament, and we'll talk about this as our last point.
Mr. Speaker, at the spring statement, the Chancellor was very proud to say inflation was down to 3% and falling. 6 interest rates in a cut. We've seen the growth figures for the early part of this year. And she says, well, the cost of borrowing's gone up. Yes, because there's a conflict in Iran. And what did she want to do? What did she want to do? When I said we wouldn't be dragged into that war because I thought through the consequences, including the economic consequences, what did she do? She said we should jump in with both feet without regard to the consequences. She can't complain now about the implications.
I mean, aside from the framing as that of, you know, we're not involved, you wanted us to be involved, we kind of just dispelled that myth with Phil. But you can see already, can't you, just as with coronavirus, just as with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that this is going to be the state, the Labour government, whoever comes after them, their way to limit people's expectations about how interventionist the state can be to help people with the crisis that they are going to, you know, we're going to experience it as communities and as households and as individuals and as mothers and, you know, all of the other things that we are. So just kind of as a closing point, Carolina, because I could genuinely talk to you all night. I could, is what are your predictions about the broader economic shock that this war will create here in the UK?
Look, you know, I know I'm going to repeat a little bit what I have been talking about, because from my perspective, of course, you can consider the direct, let's say, military expenditure and so on, and that is happening in the UK. But quite honestly, the more I look at the figures, I would say the broader economic shock will come from this long-term or sustained cost of living in fiscal squeeze, right? Which is basically driven specifically by energy and food prices, which you already explained the dynamics, which in a way should be a positive thing, because the government should like, we can fix that and protect the households. In a way, you feel like, you know, it's not a super complex problem. Oh my gosh, where inflation is coming from? It's so specific right now. It's energy and food price, which of course, in a context of tighter financial conditions, we already have reduced policy space in the UK and so on. What we have is this kind of, let's just use shock for the sake of the argument, but this negative shock of living standards on the top of a very fragile economy, which is the UK economy. So I can't, and then it is that kind of constant kind of it's like if we're stuck in this circle, which is, oh, but we can't spend, but we, you know, but we have the crisis, but we have to have more austerity measures, and that it keeps going and keeps going. So I can't see, I see this war as bringing a renewed, let's say, cost of living shock for reasons already discussed. So of course that means inflation, right? Which means then when you hear this word tighter monetary policy is exactly the increase of interest rates that we talked before, right? To trying to contain that, which then generate the problems of higher mortgage rates, rent costs, weaker business investment, you know, rising debt service costs, and all this is there. So, you know, so in a way, it becomes problematic. And then if you really had the time, you could just talk about the GDP growth in that context, the weaker growth in that moment, which is going to slow consumption, postpone investment, you know. And so basically you're talking about a prolonged stagnation in a context where you have, you know, the prime minister that has actually been extremely conservative in many aspects, but particularly from the economic, you know, in terms of economic policy, in how we can actually protect households. Because as I said, right, 6.2% rate of inflation in the 3 years, this is not just a shock. It's a social reproduction crisis in the UK, and what the government can do to deal with that. They're not even discussing that, right? What I think is interesting about the 62% and etc. is like we're just talking about the monetary aspect of this. What about what's happening to the households and so on? And I think the last point on this is, of course, the pressure, the more pressure, which is related to this on public finance and public services and so on. So is I know we shouldn't kind of spread panic, but is not a very optimistic scenario. But there is one aspect that we can be very optimistic, which is a government that can step in and deal with these problems instead of relying on old, macroeconomic frameworks, or also in terms of buying to this uncertainty and allow the financial markets to do everything, right? No, I mean, a commodity such as energy, it shouldn't be, how to say, exposed to that kind of volatility. And that can be controlled, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, so it was a bit of
no, I mean,
very pessimistic scenario.
I'm like you. We don't want to contribute to a sense of panic or a kind of overinflation of the situation, but we also have to tell the truth. And Dr. Carolina Alves, I cannot thank you enough for joining us this evening. You have taken a very, very complex set of scenarios, in relation to fuel, energy, food, mortgages, and public spending, and you've broken it down for us. Thank you so much, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invite.
No problem. That was Dr. Carolina Alves. She's Associate Professor in Economics at the University College of London. Last but not least, we've got about 10 minutes left together, is John McEvoy, my colleague. Welcome to you, John. Yeah, I mean, that was not optimistic, but she had to tell the truth about the state of what is to come in relation to the illegal war on Iran. To come back to something very specific, John, I wonder if you could talk to us about your satellite story that was just published. Was it, I feel like it was this week, was it last week? But very recently anyway. Could you talk us through that story?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, it was last week. Yeah, I mean, I was watching that clip of Keir Starmer that you put up a few minutes ago, where he's going back at Kemi Badenoch and basically saying, we were the ones who decided to stay out of this war, and therefore we're not responsible for the consequences of it. And as Phil was saying earlier, we've been very aware over the past month and a half that the US Air Force has been using RAF Fairford for the heavy bombers, the B-52s and the B-1s. We've seen the F-35s taken off and the F-16s taken off from Lakenheath. Mildenhall's been involved as well. So we know the extent to which the UK is complicit in this illegal war on Iran in terms of the use of UK bases. But we also saw a lot of kind of cryptic messaging from various different ministers over the past month or so. We had John Healey, the Defence Secretary, explaining how UK Space Command was contributing to the war effort. We also saw a kind of report from the Defence Committee, which had been privy to secret intelligence from the Ministry of Defence. And they came out and they basically said, they had this cryptic message basically saying the public pronouncements that were coming from the US, i.e. Trump, did not kind of align with the level of support that the UK government was giving. So it kind of seemed to suggest that there was a broader intelligence role that Britain was playing in this war on Iran. But obviously it's very difficult to kind of prove anything to do with intelligence. Obviously it's the most secretive element of the state. We're obviously aware that there are GCHQ stations situated across the region, particularly in Oman. But what specifically they've been doing, we cannot be 100% sure. But with another really good journalist, Abdullah Farouk, we had a look into the Ministry of Defence only Earth imaging satellite. That basically means a satellite that orbits the Earth and takes images of the surface of the Earth with a really high resolution. So what they're capable of doing, for instance, is battlefield positions, missile locations, and they orbit the Earth so frequently that they can tell kind of changes in what's going on the ground. So one day there might be several planes or fighter jets situated at a particular airbase, and the next day there might be fewer, or there might be more. So they're actually very useful. And the reason that the MOD sent this specific satellite into space was it was either relying on allies for satellite imagery, or it was relying on commercial businesses. And in the case of commercial businesses, you're basically buying, satellite imagery of them, and you're also kind of telling them what you're interested in. So it represents a kind of intelligence, a security problem for the MOD. And what Abdullah was able to do was to map out the orbit of this satellite over the past 16 or so months, and basically to find out precisely which countries it had been overflying and when. And what we found in doing this exercise, which was quite a novel bit of investigative reporting for us at Declassified, we've never done anything like this before, was that this particular satellite, the Taiki, had been orbiting Iran at very significant geopolitical moments. So just before and during the 12-day war, the number of orbits increased significantly and notably. And also during the kind of ongoing war on Iran, the number of orbits of Iran, but also the number of orbits passing directly over specific military targets, which were subsequently targeted by the US or Israel within days. So this all points to a very deliberate decision by the Ministry of Defence to not only contribute British bases for US warplanes, but also to collect and share intelligence with the two belligerent states in this conflict, which is the US and Israel. And when we went to the Ministry of Defence to ask about this, are you sharing intelligence with the US and Israel to prosecute this illegal war of aggression, they refused to comment for intelligence purposes, which is quite standard for them, but also quite telling. So that was the most recent satellite story.
And so, I mean, again, this is probably like hard to know, but I take it we're paying for this satellite as well, the UK.
Yeah, we're paying for it. I mean, this is coming out of the Ministry of Defence's budget. This is going to become a more and more important feature of UK foreign and defence policy as well. This is the first of a constellation of several different satellites that are going to be sent into orbit, which will have different, some of them will be Earth imaging satellites, others will be able to see infrared and so on. They'll have different roles basically, but it's part of the growth of UK Space Command, which is going to be a multi-billion-pound part of the UK defence budget. Now, the important thing to note about this, and we've spoken about dependence on the US earlier in this conversation, and the energy dependence, the military dependence, and there's also intelligence dependence when it comes to space operations, because while the UK is developing this sovereign space force of its own after kind of coming to the party quite late, it's nonetheless totally reliant on particularly the US and particularly Elon Musk's Starlink to actually get these satellites into space. Now, the one we're talking about, the Taiki, the Earth imaging satellite that went up in 2024, that was sent into space by Starlink. The next ones in the constellation are due to be sent to space by Starlink. So, while the MOD is kind of boasting that, now we have our own sovereign space capacity, in reality, that dependence on the US is effectively going to control, or it's going to bear upon how those satellites are actually used, right? Because if the UK can't get them into space at all without the assistance from the US, they're useless, but it also means that the US government will therefore have at least some form of control over that kind of intelligence sharing relationship that's going on at the moment, which may well explain the more recent operations over Iran.
This is just fascinating. Like, a massive congratulations for that investigation. As you say, it's quite groundbreaking to have found this. I do want us to go on and talk about the local elections, but there's just a question from YouTube. Somebody's asked, are the RAF still using Akrotiri Air Base and naval port for the private US contractors for the spy flights over Gaza?
Yeah, so the spy flights over Gaza ended some time ago with the final hostages being released, because with that the UK had no viable justification, public justification for keeping them going. However, there was for some time after those final hostages were released, and the UK had announced the ending of this surveillance mission from RAF Akrotiri over Gaza, that those planes, which are owned by Sierra Nevada Corporation, the private US contractor that you refer to, they remained stationed at RAF Akrotiri for some time, and they continued to take off and go towards Gaza, but then kind of fly around the Med for some hours and return to base. And the purpose for that is kind of unclear, whether they were on some kind of operations. It looked more like they were basically on training missions. Potentially, they were still contracted out by the Ministry of Defence for a certain amount of time. And so they just carried on, flying on the British purse string, despite having absolutely no reason to be there anymore. So as far as we're aware, since that point, they've no longer been on any kind of active operations.
Thanks, John. We've obviously got local elections coming up. People might be starting to receive, or have for some time, people knocking at their door, leaflets coming through the door. We saw that kind of very pantomime-esque final Prime Minister's questions before the local elections, where it just is like a pantomime, isn't it? And we've dispelled so much even from that clip in this show tonight. But John, I just want to know what you think the impact of foreign policy and perhaps the cost of living crisis in relation to war as a crisis that impacts the UK will do you think it'll have any impact at the local elections?
Yeah, I think it will definitely have an impact. We saw the impact of the genocide in Gaza on the previous elections. We saw several kind of Labour heavy hitters, Wes Streeting and others like him, came within hundreds of votes from shy of losing their seats, which they hadn't predicted whatsoever. And that anger hasn't gone away. That contempt for these Labour MPs who've remained in the party. Particularly Wes Streeting, who privately acknowledged that Israel was committing war crimes in his released text, and Peter Mandelson, but remained in the party and didn't dissent. So the anger for those kinds of people, and obviously these are local council elections, but for the Labour Party in general, will not have dissipated whatsoever. I think, as Carolina was saying, we haven't yet felt the full economic force of the situation around Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. But I think what Keir Starmer is doing is quite interesting, because he's been facilitated by the media to portray the UK as not being involved in this war, because he knows that position is popular with the UK with the UK population, even if it's untrue, right? The vast majority of the British public can see that this war is a total disaster. They're not fond of Donald Trump. So he's kind of positioned himself. He's trying to position the Labour Party as being on the right side of history when it comes to that conflict, and also to distract away, to have a positive point, as opposed to the entire Peter Mandelson scandal, which is just hovering over their heads at the moment. But I think the other reason that they're doing that is because the economic consequences of the Iran war, when they hit, they're going to hit relatively hard. And Keir Starmer doesn't want to be held responsible that through a factual reckoning with his actual material support for what happened. So I think that's the kind of base of what the Labour Party is. But in these local elections, we're going to see, there's a Vote Palestine campaign as well. Councillors have signed up to basically pledges regarding Palestine and BDS and so on and so forth. So there are various different things that are bearing on these elections with regards to foreign policy, and it's only going to get more important, I think.
I think that's such an interesting point, that perhaps just like with the economic shock, the kind of full force of the political shock might come later on, but these elections will also be kind of catching up from all of the shocks that we've seen over the last few months. So it will be interesting to see what impact that has on the scale of Labour's defeat. I think there will be. many defeats for Labour at these local elections. I mean, what's your feeling around that? Do you think there's going to be, it very much seems like it's a fight between Reform and the Greens, but it's quite hard to disentangle, isn't it? Because the mainstream media are obviously very, very, very kind of, it's very difficult to cut through, isn't it, if you're just looking at the mainstream media. So yeah, I'd be really interested to know. I mean, I don't know if we're all fools for trying to predict local elections and who will do the best and things like that, but what's your sense of what will happen?
Yeah, I don't want to go as far as predictions on a live stream because they always particularly on a lot. But I think one of the biggest tellers that we've seen, particularly over the last couple of weeks, is we've seen Zach Polanski absolutely running the gauntlet when it comes to the Labour Party. We've seen Steve Reid, the Minister for Housing, has basically been deployed like an attack dog for the Labour Party, throwing all forms of accusations against Zach Polanski. But also, if you look in the corporate media today and yesterday, there's been several different reports. I mean, they're going through his history, every claim he's made, every like that every post that he's liked on Blue Sky, old tweets. These are the kind of tactics of a political and media establishment that are incredibly worried about upcoming elections. So I would say I won't personally predict what will happen in these elections, but I think the Labour Party and the corporate media are predicting that the Green Party is going to do quite well, because they wouldn't be acting in the way that they were, in the way that they are. Otherwise, it recalls the Jeremy Corbyn kind of 2016 to 2018 era of just brutal nonstop, piling guns in the press, in Parliament, and so on.
Well, yeah, it very much does feel like history repeating itself, doesn't it? And I hope everyone is better prepared this time for the scale of the attacks. But John, thank you so much for all of your investigations, for your absolutely groundbreaking work for Declassified. That is the end of our time together this evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this live. It is very much appreciated. Thank you so much to people that have become donors, monthly donors, if you have during the course of this program, or donated. We genuinely appreciate it so much. That's the website link right there if you want to go and become a monthly donor. Don't forget, we're in Newcastle this weekend for a live question and answer with the makers of our documentary, and people in the audience can put your questions to both Phil and Alex. There's tickets still available on our website. And just thank you so much for reading our work, for tuning in. Thanks very much, everyone, and good night.